So hello, I'd like to welcome everyone. My name is James Robson, and I'm the Victor and William Fung Director of the Harvard Asia Center. And I'd like to welcome everyone to today's panel discussion entitled Consequences, South and Southeast Asia and the 2020 US Elections, which is part of our Asia Beyond the Headlines series, which for this year is of course being done virtually, but with all of the events recorded and then archived on the Asia Center website. So I'd like to begin by noting that today's event is being recorded, so we have to mention that to everybody, so please be aware of that. We expect the discussion to last for about 1 hour, and our esteemed group of panelists, who I'll introduce momentarily, will each begin with some opening comments for about 10 minutes each, and then there will be a discussion among the panelists. If there's some time remaining at the end, we may be able to field a few questions from the audience, from the attendees, who should use the Q&A function in the Zoom mechanism there. If you click on that, you can submit it and we'll choose from those. So, and if everybody, also if you're not speaking, if you could be on mute, that would be really helpful for everybody, just for the sound. So it's now been exactly 1 month, it may seem like a year, since the US elections that happened on November 3rd of this year. In the lead up to the elections and in the months since, there has been much speculation about the impact of that election on issues concerning US foreign policy and engagement with Asia generally. In organizing today's event, we noticed that much of the attention thus far, both in the media and also in academic panels that were happening both at Harvard and around the country, have largely been focused on East Asia. And given the tense state of US-China relations, those discussions have largely centered on China in particular. That's understandable, but all of that has led to the exclusion, for the most part, of thinking about South and Southeast Asia, which is the goal of our panel for today. While the focus in today's panel discussion is not on China, it nonetheless looms large in considerations of South and Southeast Asia. We know that the President-elect Biden will be facing some intractable issues when he takes office in January, with ongoing tensions between India and China, persistent human rights concerns across the region, as well as tricky relationships with Pakistan and the current situation in Afghanistan as well. Therefore, we're extremely grateful to have an excellent panel of speakers for today's events to help us to understand the impact of the US elections in South and Southeast Asia as we move into 2021 and beyond. So I'd like to now briefly introduce each of our panelists in alphabetical order, and then we'll move directly into their opening comments. So the first speaker today will be Fibiger, excuse me. I had already said I would get that right, and I didn't. Who's an assistant professor of business administration at Harvard Business School. And Professor Fibiger conducts research on 20th century international history, focusing primarily on political economy and diplomacy in Southeast Asia. His current book manuscript is entitled Suharto's Cold War, Indonesia, Southeast Asia, and the World. Our second speaker will be Erik Kuhonta, the Associate Professor of Political Science at McGill University. And Professor Kuhonta's research interests are comparative politics and Southeast Asian politics, including political economy of development, especially inequality, political institutions, and states and political parties, democracy and democratization, and qualitative methods and comparative historical analysis. Our third speaker will be Doreen Lee. She is an associate professor of anthropology at Northeastern University and also a visiting scholar at the Harvard Asia Center this year. Professor Lee writes, research, and teaches about urban politics, Southeast Asia, and critical theory. Her first book, Activist Archives, Youth Culture and the Political Past in Indonesia, is published by Duke University Press. Her current research project focuses on urban housing, infrastructure, and the formation of new publics in Indonesia. And then finally, our final speaker will be Ashutosh Varshney, the sole Goldman Professor of International Studies and Social Sciences, and a Professor of Political Science, and the director of the Center for Contemporary South Asia at Brown University. Professor Varshney's research and teaching covers three areas: ethnicity and nationalism, the political economy of development, and South Asian politics and political economy. His books include Battles Half Won, India's Improbable Democracy of 2013, Collective Violence in Indonesia of 2009, and also Ethnic Conflict and Civic Life, Hindus and Muslims in India, published by Yale University Press in 2002. He's currently working on three projects: a multi-country project on cities and ethnic conflict, political economy of urbanization in India, and Indian politics and society between elections. So thank you all very much for joining us today. And I think we'll move directly into our first speaker, to Mats. And so we'll turn it over to you, Mats, and I know you can share your screen now.
Thanks for the introduction. Let me say before I begin what a pleasure it is to be speaking alongside such a distinguished group of scholars whose work I have truly long admired. Let me share my screen as I work to orient myself here. So the task before us is to ponder the implications of the American election for South and Southeast Asia. And as James mentioned, I'm a specialist on Southeast Asia, particularly political economy and international relations. So I will focus on what I know best. Now, Southeast Asia is an enormous and diverse region of more than 10 states, almost 700 million people, and together the world's fifth largest economy. And it's tough to do justice to such a big region in only 10 minutes. So what I'll try to do is highlight two themes that I think have swept the region over the last decade or so, and think about how Biden's election will affect them. And those themes are, on the one hand, the rise of China, and on the other hand, the rise of populisms. Let me also caveat that by saying that one could easily choose other themes equally as important. For instance, the threat of climate change, challenges to the centrality of ASEAN, or even the shifting center of gravity in the region northward, or even the bifurcation of the region between North and South. But again, I'm going to focus on these two themes because I think they're particularly salient. So, China. China is now Southeast Asia's largest trading partner. Here you see Southeast Asian goods imports, China the largest external power here. Southeast Asian good exports, again, China the largest destination for Southeast Asian exports as well. And China is also a growing source of foreign direct investment for Southeast Asia, although not presently as important as, say, Japan. It is a growing presence in the region. And with its increasing economic footprint, China's political and military footprint in the region has increased as well. Now, some commentators have suggested that this is a return to tribute system dynamics of old. And I think that misses everything that's interesting about China's rise in Southeast Asia. You have the sheer size of the People's Republic and the ambitions of its political project. You have the advent of popular nationalism in Southeast Asia, and you have the industrial era's sheer ability to reshape landscapes and seascapes, the cradles of civilization in Southeast Asia. So the Trump administration, for its part, presided over what I think is a dramatic reorientation of American foreign policy toward competition with China. But the Trump administration was also conspicuous by its absence from regional diplomacy. Trump and his senior-most foreign policy aides rarely attended the annual summits put together by ASEAN, and key American ambassadorial posts throughout the region sat empty for long periods of time. Meanwhile, Trump withdrew the United States from what became the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, and not surprisingly, in this context, perceptions of American influence in Southeast Asia waned. So here you have a survey taken by ICES, a think tank in the region, that asked about 1,300 regional elites a series of questions. And this one is, which country or regional organization is the most influential economic power in Southeast Asia? And obviously the answer here that most gave is China, up 7% roughly, 6%, excuse me, between 2019 and 2020. And that's also true of China's increasing political and strategic influence. Same question asked to the same group of people, this time about political and strategic influence. China's up from 45% who say it's the most influential actor to 52%. Now, to be clear, there is growing anxiety in the region about China's increasing footprint. The IC's poll revealed large majorities of people who think that China is the most influential economic power are worried about China's rise. And the same is true, an even higher portion who believe that China is the most influential political and strategic actor are worried about China's rise. And you can also see that the region's states have begun importing larger and larger quantities of arms as China has grown more assertive, especially in the South China Sea. But even when the Trump administration did show up in regional diplomacy, its efforts were, I think, confused and contradictory. Here you have Secretary of State Mike Pompeo on a recent tour throughout the region. And in his speeches in regional capitals, he hectored regional audiences to take a stand between what he characterized as a Sino-American rivalry motivated by ideological concerns, especially the clash of democracy and dictatorship. Almost simultaneously, though, Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer announced that the United States would withdraw hundreds of millions of dollars of trade preferences from Thailand and investigate Vietnam for currency manipulation. And these twin impulses of American foreign policy, Pompeo and what you might call the new Cold Warriors on the one hand, and Lighthizer and what you might call the America Firsters on the other, went over as you might expect them to, and that is like a lead balloon. So what does Biden's election mean for Southeast Asia? I think it's unlikely that Biden is going to reorient US foreign policy away from competition with China. After all, a hostile outlook toward the People's Republic is the closest thing, I think, to a bipartisan consensus in Washington today. And even for someone like Biden, who I think has been historically inclined toward more dovish positions on China, one hears a lot about the potential political utility of an anti-Chinese stance, particularly for issues he cares about. You can think of an anti-Chinese stance for early childhood education in the United States, or research and development funding, or infrastructure investment, or even industrial policy writ large. So I do think that Biden will place a renewed emphasis on multilateralism, and American diplomats will do the bare minimum, which is show up. We can expect, I think, a more coherent, a more predictable, and a more professionally managed American foreign policy under Biden. But Biden is also going to be consumed by domestic issues, especially in the earliest stage of his presidency. I'm thinking of the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic fallout from it. And regardless of who wins the Senate runoffs in Georgia, Biden is, I think, going to confront an American Congress that is generally hostile to the kinds of policies that might really increase American influence in Southeast Asia, like rejoining the TPP. And it seems to me also unlikely that the United States will provide for Southeast Asian states desperate for infrastructure investment a meaningful alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative. Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad, recently ousted from Malaysia, said effectively, whether we like it or not, we have to go to the Chinese. Fundamentally, there is little alternative. So ultimately then, on this question of China, I see more change than continuity, or more continuity than change, excuse me, between Biden and Trump. Okay, let me talk quickly about democracy and populism because I'm running a bit short on time, I think. So in recent years, Southeast Asia has obviously witnessed the rise of new forms of populism, from the violent law and order populism of Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines to the softer, what's been called technocratic populism of Jokowi in Indonesia. And these populisms have strained existing democratic institutions across the region, and I think contributed to a region-wide sense of democratic backsliding. Now, Trump obviously exhibited few compunctions about saddling up to authoritarian populist leaders. He embarked upon a bromance with Duterte, and the same with the leader of the military junta in Thailand who recently became the elected president. But I think despite some more solipsistic American commentaries that suggest that Trump is the vanguard of democratic decline across the world, Trumpism was largely epiphenomenal to the emergence of populisms in Southeast Asia. Or I think more precisely, Trumpism and Southeast Asian populisms both are manifestations of larger forces of backlash against globalization and inequality, and all refracted and reflected through the lens of particular national, institutional, and ideological contexts. So how will Biden change things here? He has, I think, indicated a desire to infuse American foreign policy with a renewed sense of democratic mission. And this is consonant with his desire to hearken back to sacred truths on the domestic front as well. For instance, he promised within his first year in office to hold a summit of global democracies. And this is where his emphasis on democracy and mission blends with his approach toward China, as you see in this quote from his recent foreign affairs piece here. I think Biden's approach here is unlikely to be greeted with much enthusiasm in Southeast Asia. And this is not to suggest, I think, that Biden should embrace a crude realpolitik and stand idly by in the face of injustices like, say, the 1MDB scandal in Malaysia, which ignited popular revulsion against an incumbent regime and against China as well. But it is to suggest that an emphasis on democracy is unlikely to win Biden many friends. After all, a lot of blatantly illiberal developments in the region, whether the genocide against the Rohingya in Myanmar or the drug war in the Philippines, remain fundamentally politically popular among majorities of the population. Now, Biden's is an experienced foreign policy team, and they are quite adept at walking the tightrope between ideals and interests. But on this score, I think Biden will also evoke or evince more continuity with Trump than change. So ultimately then, I'm a historian, so I like to think about these questions. I think historians 30 years from now will see a Biden presidency as less consequential for Southeast Asia than a Trump presidency. And even then, I think the reality is that American elections are becoming less and less relevant for Southeast Asian states. And I'm not sure that's altogether a bad thing. So with that provocation, I will see.
Great, thank you very much, Mats. So let's move directly then into our second speaker, Professor Erik Kuhonta, and I'll turn the mic over to you.
Thank you. I want to start by thanking James for inviting me to discuss with you Southeast Asian politics and U.S. foreign policy. I will take off from some of Mats's comments, and I will actually deviate from his conclusion on some level, but I think what he has just said is very, very insightful and very provocative. Now, in my brief 10 minutes, what I want to do is very briefly state what was the general thrust of the Trump administration in Southeast Asia, and then I will discuss the likely direction of the incoming Biden administration, focusing on 4 key points. And then out of those 4 key points, I will zero in on one of them, and that is the question of human rights and democracy, which I will argue should really be the key concern for those interested in advancing and engaging with reform in Southeast Asia. And then in conclusion, I will discuss a few points of how one might go about this in this current geopolitical climate. So on the Trump administration, what's clear is that there was really no coherent policy of the Trump administration in Southeast Asia. It was often very erratic and generally not interested in the region. That was evident by the fact that Trump only attended one summit, the APEC summit and ASEAN summit in 2017. But other than that, deputized officials to the region and really showed no interest in the key issues and meeting with the leaders of Southeast Asian nations. He's shown an aggressive policy towards China that has elicited support from some Southeast Asian countries, but he's also shown relative disdain for questions of human rights, particularly in his championing of someone like Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines. Now, in general, thus, I'd argue that the Trump administration in Southeast Asia has been quite erratic, inconsistent, incoherent, and generally not terribly interested in the region. Now, the Biden administration, what we've seen so far in terms of the cabinet picks and the general presentation and what we know of Biden is that it will be a focus on multilateralism, on internationalization, on some sense of US engagement with the world away from the kind of erratic isolationism of Trump. And what I'd argue flows from there are four key points in relation to Southeast Asian politics. First, as has already been made clear by the Biden platform, human rights and democracy will be given somewhat more emphasis. And that matters for Southeast Asia. And that is the point I'm going to zero in on in a few minutes. Secondly, in the thrust of multilateralism and internationalization, it is possible that there will be re-engagement with international trade partnerships. The most important one, the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, failed in the wake of the 2016 elections. And there have been efforts in Asia to resurrect it, but in a somewhat different version without the United States. Will the United States recommit to the TPP? Hard to say. Biden has signaled some interest, but there's got to be reforms from the earlier version that eventually collapsed. And some questions of labor, environmental standards that are wanted by the left wing, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party will have to be addressed. And so the question of political capital, how much to expend on that, will be at the heart of the question of whether to re-engage with a TPP. But that's secondly, international trade is in some sense part of a multilateralist direction. Third, clearly non-traditional security issues will also be given greater emphasis in the Biden administration. That has been signaled very powerfully by the choice of former Secretary of State John Kerry to serve as the envoy for climate. John Kerry clearly knows Southeast Asia very well, and having him here to frontline the fight to deal with climate change, I think, is quite significant. But not just climate change, also the global pandemic. Those are issues that require significant collaboration with international and regional organizations. And so in that sense, we should see that kind of engagement in the world and therefore also with Southeast Asia. And the fourth point, in terms of, again, emphasis on multilateralism, on international and regional institutions, is the actual taking seriously of the ASEAN meetings, of ASEAN forums, actually attending these meetings and taking these organizations seriously. This is something Trump was completely uninterested in doing. But in ASEAN, in Southeast Asia, this matters. This matters significantly because ASEAN leaders take these meetings, these in-person meetings, as very consequential in terms of actually getting things done. And one cliche about ASEAN is often that decisions are made in these kind of golf courses, cocktails, and these hallway meetings. And so missing out on that is significant in terms of not showing interest in the region. So taking organizations, international and regional organizations seriously should be a part of this larger multinational internationalization direction that one would expect with the incoming Biden administration. So those are the 4 points that I think one could see for issue areas: human rights, trade partnerships, international trade, non-traditional security issues, and taking seriously regional organizations such as ASEAN in Southeast Asia. Now, in terms of human rights, this is the issue area that I want to really focus on. And I think human rights and democracy in Southeast Asia should be a key concern for those interested in the betterment of the conditions, political conditions in Southeast Asia. Now, human rights remain deeply problematic in Southeast Asia, and this is true of both regimes that are democratic and regimes that are not democratic. In terms of democracy in Southeast Asia, we have very few out of 11 nations that are democratic, as measured by some basic indicators like Freedom House and others. Indonesia, Timor-Leste, the Philippines, and most recently Malaysia generally rank relatively higher on these democracy indices. But even in this group of relatively few democratic nations, they have deep problems of human rights violations and illiberal practices. So Philippines, as I already mentioned, under Duterte, has waged a drug war that has led to way over 20,000 deaths. And I should note that this is much more than under the Ferdinand Marcos dictatorship that lasted, the martial law that lasted some 14 years in the Philippines. And Duterte just right now under a 6-year term, more than 20,000 deaths. And even Indonesia, you've also seen a number of illiberal laws being passed that violate the rights of sexual minorities or of ethnic minorities. These are also problematic in countries that are relatively democratic vis-a-vis their other neighbors in Southeast Asia. But if we go beyond these democracies in Southeast Asia, in authoritarian regimes, in more hardcore authoritarian regimes, as well as so-called hybrid regimes, we also see significant problems of illiberalism, of human rights violations. Myanmar, a sort of transitional hybrid regime, deeply problematic. The attack, the ethnic cleansing and genocide against the Rohingya, as well as in Cambodia, we have problems of Hun Sen taking greater power, and in Vietnam also attacks on civil society. So even across, so not surprisingly, in authoritarian regimes, problems of human rights remain deeply problematic. So across the region, the larger point I want to make is whether it's democratic or authoritarian regimes, questions of human rights, of liberal norms are deeply problematic and need to be addressed in the long run. The second point I want to make about this, about human rights, is that an emphasis on some level on human rights would be a clear contrast, would stand as a stark contrast from the Trump administration that has generally not shown, has been erratic in this, but in general has shown no real focused interest on this question. And human rights and democracy in past US administrations has often stood as a central pillar of their focus in foreign policy. It's been problematic, and I will address this at the end, but it has at least stood rhetorically as a key concern. And the third point I'll make about human rights is that, and here's where it gets to the problematic, the challenges, is that of course the Biden administration will have to manage their own geopolitical strategic interests, particularly when dealing with China and establishing some alliance with Southeast Asian nations vis-a-vis China. And in that sense, navigate how to deal with human rights and geopolitics at the same time. That's a perennial question, perennial issue that administrations have always had to deal with, but something in the context of a rising China that will become even more crucial. I will conclude by saying the following, that human rights and democracy remains a central issue, problem that one cannot ignore in the current contemporary politics of Southeast Asia. The question for any great power administration is not so much whether to engage it or not, but how to engage it. And the problem that the United States has faced and other Western powers have faced in the past when engaging with human rights in Asia and in Southeast Asia, both East Asia and Southeast Asia, has been the sense of hypocrisy, of inconsistency, of erraticness by US governments as well as human rights organizations, the sense that they pick and choose which ones to criticize, as well as the fact that in Western countries themselves, there are numerous problems in terms of civil rights, and that it is therefore unfair to pick on developing countries when there are numerous problems in those home countries. And so the questions of Asian values and human rights has always risen to the top as a response to Western criticisms. I'd argue there are two ways to address this. One is that in this emphasis on multilateralism of the incoming Biden administration, if the administration, and this is true for Western countries in general, make progress on things that can be categorized as broad public goods, such as the global pandemic or climate change, these things can foster significant confidence, goodwill in terms of spillover effects that could provide in the process a bridge an avenue for dialogue on more contentious issues for which Southeast Asian governments are more reluctant to discuss. But broadly, progress on things like climate change and the global pandemic, as well as broadly economic development, could yield significant dividends on a more problematic issue like human rights. And the last point I'll say about how one might engage human rights is that while surely frontal criticism of human rights will always be necessary, there are also other avenues that might be slower, more gradual, but can still open up in the long term improvements in human rights. And here, rule of law, focusing on rule of law through, for example, supporting local organizations or providing research support for understanding how to improve rule of law, dialogue on questions of rule of law, all of these can, in the long run, make headway towards improving human rights. And so I think one has to engage with human rights in the region. I think that is something that has been relatively consistent in US foreign policy, at least rhetorically. And the question I think that remains here is how to do it more effectively than in the past. And as I've said, two things, progress in public goods and also on rule of law could make headway in the long run. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Professor Kuhonta, and bringing up this issue of human rights here. It is intriguing to think about how the US election on November 3rd was then closely followed by the elections on November 8th that took place in Myanmar and all of the issues related to disenfranchisement there. So certainly something to think about in terms of how those took place in different in our own country and also what happened there. So thank you very much. Let's now turn to our third speaker, Professor Doreen Lee, and I will turn it over to you to share your screen.
Thank you, James. And thank you again for inviting me to be part of this panel. And I'd like to thank the prior presenters for setting up such a comprehensive framework of the political economy of Southeast Asia and how the region is actually benefiting in large part from the neglect of the last 4 years. So I'm going to concentrate my remarks primarily on Indonesia, where I do most of my research. And I'm going to turn to a more micro level of societal perceptions about the US and try to draw some comparisons between the US and Indonesia. So I'll start with a quick factoid, which perhaps has been a sort of forgotten historical fact, which is in its first few years of independence, and indeed in its transition from self-declared independence in 1945 to fully recognized international level acceptance of Indonesia as a republic in 1950, Indonesia was known as the United States of Indonesia, and it followed a federated states model before it became the kind of unitary Republic of Indonesia that you see today. So that's just an interesting historical aside. And the general feeling, I'm going to give away the punchline, the general feeling in Indonesia is that regardless of the winner of the election, ASEAN countries will continue to benefit from ongoing US-China competition, and that Indonesia in particular is really well poised to maintain a strategic neutrality in its negotiations with the two superpowers. And of course, while claiming an important leadership position in ASEAN as the largest country, the largest market, so forth and so on. In fact, the day after the election, the stock market went up in Indonesia. So again, a point being made about how the stock market is not the economy, but certainly in Indonesia, there was a positive impact immediately following the US elections. So I'll first speak about the popular cultural commentary surrounding the US elections in Indonesia, as well as some similarities drawn between the political polarities and cultural wars in Indonesia and the US, and then shed light on why national controversies about the new labor laws and investment legislation remains much more relevant for Indonesians today in thinking about global local connections. And finally, I'll end with some of my own speculations about the implications of the incoming Biden administration for Indonesians. And so now I'll share my screen. Okay. So when Trump refused to concede the election, Indonesians and observers of Indonesia immediately made the connection to their own contested presidential election last year. So in the 2019 election, Joko Widodo, or Jokowi, the incumbent, and the ultra-nationalist and right-wing former military general Prabowo Subianto ran a very tight race, separated by a few million votes. And this was not the first time they ran against each other. In fact, in 2014, Jokowi and Prabowo had already faced off in an election that Jokowi won. So when Jokowi won his second term in office, Prabowo refused to concede, instead filing a suit at the Supreme Court to allege his own victory. Prabowo ultimately lost his claim, and the matter would have ended as one of bitter political rivalry between centrist and illiberal factions, except then Jokowi asked Prabowo to become his new defense minister. So images of the two men embracing indicated an end to hostilities. Yet this outcome might be unimaginable in the US today. So when US elections prompted expressions of humor, perplexity, and derision around the world, I would say particularly in Europe, but certainly in parts of Asia as well, the Indonesian response was that the US election was version 2.0 of the Indonesian election last year. So the joke worked on two fronts. The first, that Indonesia, like the US, was already a divided country. From the 2014 elections to 2019 elections, the two candidates had polarized and split families, friends, work colleagues, and neighbors into opposing camps. These fights played out on social media, especially on Twitter and through memes, where each candidate's supporters, both paid and voluntary digital armies, deployed aggressive trolling techniques to attack each other and make inflated and false claims about their candidates. Okay. And so one of the highlights here that I want to think about in terms of US impact on Indonesian politics is a general political culture of misinformation and populism, and how sophisticated as well as brutal some of these techniques are. The second facet of the joke played on the similarities between the two personalities, Trump and Prabowo, right-wing populist, inciting sort of violent, worked-up responses from their supporters through incendiary tweets and so on, and ultimately out of touch with the masses because of their wealth and power. Yet Indonesians joke that the comparison was wrong. It would only be accurate if Biden made Trump his Secretary of Defense. The popular TV show Narasi, featuring the talk show host and TV journalist Najwa Shihab, created a short web episode to explain the Electoral College in the US and to pose a question. The show asked, what if Indonesia ran its elections following the US model? The simulation that the Narasi team created, transposing an electoral college system onto Indonesia's provinces, was ultimately a very cheeky way to prove to their audience that the popular vote and the electoral vote strongly coincided and supported Jokowi's wins in both elections. So the takeaway message was that the ebullient and bombastic populist figures of Trump and Prabowo were ultimately legally without merit. And I thought this was quite a clever way of broadcasting to a very young audience and a very politically aware audience of this TV show, that there were some dissimilarities between the US democratic system and Indonesia's democratic system. And I want to go back in time to say that, in contrast, there was much more nostalgia and excitement in Indonesia in 2008 with Obama's win. And the kind of popular mediatic attention paid to the US election then was genuinely a reflection of an authentic connection between Indonesia and the US. A statue of Obama as a child was even installed in a park in his former neighborhood. And Obama's visits to Indonesia shed light on how cultural connections between the US and Indonesia would be better served by expanding diplomatic efforts through enlarging education portfolio, for example, and through increasing study abroad opportunities or expanding the number of Fulbright fellowships, for example. And around the same time, the SBY administration began to seriously consider how to unfold its diasporic community, including lots of wealthy, educated, and skilled individuals in the US, back into its plans for national development. So you have there, a dozen years ago, a kind of synergy between styles of leadership and aspirations about cultural exchange. And again, when you look at the Trump administration, in contrast, as Matt's described, the approach has been haphazard and one of neglect. And but the Trump administration has been quite favorable to Indonesia and has sought to reinforce bilateral ties of Indonesia in the context of US-China rivalry. And one main mechanism for doing that was to extend the preferred nation status to Indonesia under the generalized system of preferences, which allows its exports to the US to flow tariff-free. And this is very significant as the volume of trade in this year alone, I think, exceeds $30 billion. We'll see that this matters a lot for Indonesia because India, for example, recently lost its preferred nation status. There are some longer-term commitments to think about in terms of US-Indonesia relations and how they will impact regional security in Southeast Asia, which is that there is a fairly well-established commitment between US and Indonesia in terms of increasing military exercises, in terms of increasing exchange and having Indonesian military officers go on programs to the US, for instance, and also to purchase hardware. So right before Mike Pompeo visited Indonesia, the Minister of Defense, Prabowo, was in the US also discussing these security arrangements. And I think I want to just describe very briefly Mike Pompeo's second visit to Indonesia, which took place right before the US elections on October 29. And his one-day visit was packed full with various visits to the foreign minister, to the president, but also to the largest Muslim organization in Indonesia, Nahdlatul Ulama. And it was very striking that Pompeo took all of these three meetings as an opportunity to inflame anti-Chinese sentiment by referring to the coronavirus as the virus that originated in Wuhan more than once, and also highlighting human rights abuses by China against its ethnic Muslim minorities. But the visit was seen largely as an ineffective attempt to place a wedge between Indonesia and China, given the real volume of infrastructural investment by China in the region and in Indonesia in particular. And one small addition to the portfolio of investment is that China and Indonesia have signed an agreement for vaccine production of China's vaccine for COVID-19 in Indonesia. And that is, I think, a very significant achievement that has received positive attention in the region. So I think the issue that has most galvanized Indonesians this year has less been about foreign influences from China or the US and more about the Indonesian government's recent ratification of a huge 1,000-page document that sought changes to about 79 laws to improve business efficacy and the investment climate in Indonesia. As the other presenters have mentioned, this omnibus law has removed protections and rights of workers and also deregulated environmental protections. And so since October, Indonesians have been protesting all around the country in mass protests. And there have been mass arrests of thousands of people, and mostly young people, high school students and university students in these protests. And so that is the kind of national environment and contestation about increased globalization in Indonesia, whether or not the beneficiary or the recipient or the investor is either the US or China. I think that's the kind of climate that they're going to enter into. So I'm going to end with some speculations for the future. I do think that the new administration might return to an established American tradition of calling attention to human rights violations in the region, and that some kind of subtle pressure will be asserted on Indonesia to allow more human rights investigations, or at least oversight in very troubled areas like Papua, which is completely off limits right now, and that Australia, for example, has made no headway in its diplomatic efforts to engage Indonesia in. There should be more oversight in resource-rich Kalimantan, which is set to be the new investment staging ground for foreign investment as Indonesia builds its new capital city there. There's environmental impact to think about, but also the fact that Jokowi announced that they were going to put together a new sovereign fund, and one would start to hear the alarm bells ringing considering the fate of 1MDB, but this new sovereign fund would involve the UAE, it involves Tony Blair, I mean, it involves a lot of actors, and this needs to be paid attention to. And as Erik mentioned, how the US moves on the issue of climate change will also determine the kinds of commitments ASEAN countries will be forced to make, and that there will be concessions to at least maintain the bare minimum of environmental protections, which have seemingly been undone by legislation such as the Omnibus Law. And finally, to sort of look at more cultural impacts that I think most observers have not mentioned, is that we might see more societal level change that ensues from the inspiring model of the Biden administration's inclusive cabinet, right, and operations teams, which have more women and women of color than all previous administrations. And I think this has an impact in progressive circles and in activist circles where Indonesians have openly expressed admiration for progressive women-led governments in Iceland and New Zealand, for instance. But the hopes for what would be a radically different kind of Indonesian politician are actually probably more modest, but also more insurmountable. I think the hope that civilian leaders can shed their dependency on military allies, and that justice-oriented and corruption-free leaders who do not belong to the class of oligarchs who dominate natural resource extraction or have media monopolies and real estate empires might one day actually gain traction on the crest of popular movements that you're seeing in Indonesia or Thailand or and other countries as well. So I think that the other two presenters have already brought up how continuities with past positions might allow for sort of careful diplomacy. But I also think that there are cultural effects to consider. And one is the kind of political culture of misinformation and polarization. And the second is whether or not there might be new models for leadership styles that will be taken up by young people across the region. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Professor Lee. And I think it was in her comments where India first is mentioned here specifically. And so this leads us wonderfully into our final speaker, Professor Ashutosh Varshney. And I will turn it over to you to share your screen. Thank you.
I will focus on India and South Asia, of course. And I'll start with some it's a brief overview of the historical determinants of US-India/South Asia relationship. And basically three factors have shaped that. And I'll then talk about how those factors are still relevant or what has been added in more recent years. So one is geopolitics or security, the other is economics, and the third is shared democratic values, or what Erik called, an emphasis on human rights, which goes up and down in American foreign policy depending on who's president and what the project is. The Cold War dynamics between which shows the interaction between these three elements can be summarized as follows. Geopolitics, as we know, was focused on countering the Soviet Union. And since India did not join anti-Soviet alliances, prominently SEATO and CENTO, and Pakistan did, India and the US could not come close, even though India was a democracy in this period. India's economic performance was also mediocre, and India's markets were more or less irrelevant to American businesses. US came closer to Pakistan for geostrategic reasons, even though Pakistan was not a democracy for much of this period till 1991, and was not a big market either. It was a purely geostrategic relationship that developed between India and Pakistan. India-US relationship was especially tense during the India-Pakistan War of 1971, when East Pakistan broke away to form Bangladesh with the aid of India. Nixon deployed the 7th Fleet, the Navy's 7th Fleet, to somehow prevent the breakup of Pakistan, but he didn't succeed. Soviet backing of India countered Nixon's move. So that's the summary until 1991. Post-Cold War developments can be summarized as follows, before we come to Biden or Trump. India and the United States have come closer after the Cold War. All three determinants of the relationship began to work in the same direction of increasing friendship. First, there was the dissolution of the Soviet Union meant that the strategic irritant, which was the biggest irritant in the relationship, disappeared. Second, India's economy after the 1991 reforms started booming, making the Indian markets attractive for American businesses. Growth rate since 1990 second only to China's among the large size economies. And India today is the 6th largest economy in the world, close to about $2.9 trillion or so is the GDP. And democracy continued to thrive in India. An additional factor that emerged in this period after 1991 was the role of Indian Americans, who became very rich, and as a rich community started, their numbers were not large, but as a very rich community, according to the census, the richest minority of America today, by 2010 census, started contributing to American political campaigns. All US presidents since 1999 have visited India. Clinton, Bush, Obama twice, and even Trump went to India in last February, 7 months ago. Trump also joined Modi in some of his, not official meetings, Modi's community meetings. For example, one in Houston, where both Modi and Trump addressed 20, 30,000 people. And in India, Trump and Modi addressed 100,000 people in a cricket stadium. Okay. So Biden, now we come to Biden with this background. What about the geostrategic factor? After the emerging tensions with China, India's geostrategic significance has grown and is likely to grow further. Not only has the US, in a bipartisan consensus, come to see China as a key adversary or a competitor, whichever way you want to describe it. India-China border clashes that erupted this summer also make China a prominent source of worry for Indian decision makers, India in general. Economic, though Indian economy is among the worst hit by COVID, it's likely to bounce back, continuing to be in the top 6-7 economies of the world. That's what $3 trillion would do. That is still less than 1/4 of China's GDP. But then China's growth has been truly phenomenal, and even the second fastest growing economy in the global south among the large-sized economies has been able to grow only at 6 to 7% rather than 10. Which is what 9 to 10, which has been China's growth rate since 1980 roughly. And democracy, under Modi, India's democracy has declined. Electorally continues to be vibrant, but what Erik called the liberal elements, the human rights, the freedom of expression, the freedom of religious practice, the freedom of association, all of them have the so-called liberal elements of democracy have suffered. Of particular concern is Modi's treatment of minorities, especially the Muslims. Here is what Blinken has already made. The Secretary of State designate has already made 2 speeches on India in the last 6 months. Here's a speech on August 15, 2020, to celebrate India's independence. That's India's Independence Day with the Indian American community. Kamala Harris was not present, but a lot of others were present there. quote, "We would be an advocate for India to play a leading role in international institutions, and that includes helping India get a seat on a United Nations Security Council. We have a common challenge which has to deal with an increasingly assertive China across the board, including its aggression towards India at the line of actual control, but also using its economic might to coerce others and reap unfair advantage." I excluded the next two sentences, which have to do about the freedom of navigation in the seas. That has also been mentioned there. He also made another speech. Blinken made another speech on India in July 22 at the Hudson Institute in Washington. And I quote from that: "We obviously have challenges now and real concerns, for example, about some of the actions of the Indian government has taken, particularly in cracking down on freedom of movement and freedom of speech in Kashmir, and some of the laws on citizenship. But you are always better engaging with a partner, and a vitally important one like India, when you can speak frankly and directly about areas where you have differences, even as you're working to build greater cooperation and strengthen the relationship going forward." The citizenship law, the new citizenship law, I can discuss at length if necessary, but basically it's anti-Muslim. And for the first time, religion has been linked to citizenship in India's post-independence history. There was complete religious equality constitutionally and in citizenship laws as well, but that now an anti-Muslim law has been passed on citizenship. And Kashmir was the only Muslim majority state of India where Kashmir's status as a state has disappeared, and legally through parliamentary legislation. It's now directly ruled by Delhi, and Kashmir. Thousands of politicians, certainly hundreds, if not thousands, of politicians, civil society leaders, and others were imprisoned for almost a year. Many are still in jail, though the most important ones have been released in the last few weeks. So what does this lead to? And I think, so I will be within my 10 minutes. What is the likely Biden-Blinken policy on South Asia/India? Let me just summarize India first, and then I'll say something about Pakistan. Build closer security relationship with India, elevating it to a higher level, is definitely in the cards. It's very likely. The military exercises now take place regularly, and Australia and Japan have started joining those exercises. So you would likely to get a quadrilateral kind of relationship emerging between Australia, Japan, India, and the United States. And first it was India, United States doing joint military exercises this year, or the last year, I think. Japan and Australia also joined the exercise. This is some kind of anti-China alliance. Not alliance, relationship emerging. I don't think it will be formally an alliance. We can go into why it won't be formally an alliance, but a relationship, which is multilateral and aimed at China. Expressed concerns about democratic decline in India behind closed doors. It's not openly confronted. This is what will happen. And try to persuade Modi to moderate his anti-Muslim thrust. If the American foreign policy can achieve that, it'll be a very big achievement for liberals all over the world, I think. So behind closed doors, persuade Modi to moderate his anti-Muslim thrust and restore the vigor of India's freedoms, not simply the vigor of elections, but the vigor of freedoms, as part of a larger democratic argument, or part of a larger democratic concern, not simply a concern with elections. India has no concern with elections, per se. And deepen economic ties, especially given what's happening in China. But there's a new issue, climate change. And Kerry's appointment, high-profile appointment, suggests that it will be an important part of the foreign policy and what Erik rightly called a non-traditional form of security. India is the world's third largest polluter after China and the United States. And as the US returns to the Paris Accord, which is most likely, it will need cooperation from India as well as China. And I think some kind of India will have to play a big role in the Paris Accord in collaboration with the United States. And that's one reason why America-China relationship also will not go into a complete rupture because China is needed for climate negotiations. Whatever one can say about the economic, I don't think a complete economic disengagement is possible either. It's not possible. So while geostrategic concerns will have an effect on US-China and US-India economic relations, there will be an economic fallout, but that doesn't mean a complete economic disengagement from China. It is impossible. At least in the short to medium term, it's impossible to do that. And we can get into the numbers. I could have produced the numbers for you. India will benefit from that, from the emerging tensions between China and the United States. But on the climate side, all three will have to work together. The three biggest polluters will have to work together, or the climate future of this world will be in substantial jeopardy. Let me just stop there.
Thank you very much, Professor Varshney. And so I would like to give the panelists just a few minutes. We're a little bit past the 1 o'clock time, but I think if everybody is willing to stay for just a few minutes longer, I'd like to see if any of the panelists would like to either respond or question any of their fellow panelists. And I know that Matt's has to leave shortly, so I would maybe give him the first opportunity if he would like to say something, and then others can chime in after that. And I may end with one final question of my own as well. So Mats, would you like to?
Sure. Let me just, again, stress how fascinated I was by my co-panelist's presentation. I think my question would highlight these issues of liberalism, human rights, norms, and they would hearken back to traditions of diplomacy, both in India, South and Southeast Asia, particularly the Bandung principles of non-interference, which are also instantiated in the founding charter of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And I will have to leave before I can hear my question answered, but I would be fascinated to hear my co-panelists discuss how they think the United States can navigate that foreign policy issue, especially as China purports to abide heartily by the Bandung principles of non-interference and is one of the key attractions of partnership with China for the more illiberal states in the region. So thank you all so much.
Thank you, Matt. And since this is recorded, he'll be able to hear the answer later. If any of you would like to respond to Matt's or to each other, either is fine.
I might just add that as commentators, including me, I write a column in an Indian newspaper in addition to my academic work. As commentators have called attention to a likely human rights shift in American foreign policy after Trump. One criticism that has emerged is that it will amount to interference, right? And sovereignty of nations, that principle requires non-interference. And I have something to say about that, but I just want to say that it's not simply the Bandung principles. In India, I think, was a signatory to Bandung Charter. But not ASEAN Charter. It's not part of ASEAN. But non-interference is the standard response of nationalists, especially those who don't want their records examined by the community of nations around them.
Great. Anybody else like to either respond to Mats's comment or just raise another issue in relationship to the other speakers? Erik?
Yeah, I'll just say that when Mats has raised the question of non-interference is central to ASEAN. It's been central since 1967 and ASEAN founded. And it's been a rhetorical refrain that ASEAN leaders have used all the time ad nauseum to reject any criticism. I think it's you can't avoid it. I think we can't ignore the power that the theme of non-interference holds. And I think what's important is also to understand the historical basis for this and the sense that imperialism, colonialism is not that far off for many of these leaders in Southeast Asia. I think we should not dismiss that. On the other hand, It is also true that there are a number of ASEAN leaders, well, for sure civil society, but there are also a number of ASEAN leaders who have tried to move away from non-interference as the guiding principle of the organization and of international affairs in the region. And even people who you would not expect to hear it from, but someone like Mattias and others in that vein have also at times questioned it, particularly when it has to deal with governments that are not their own, such as Myanmar or others. So I think what I'd say about non-interference is it is obviously the key bulwark that will be raised again, rhetorical bulwark that will be raised against Western countries seeking to challenge and human rights violations, to make progress in that direction. But I think it'd be a mistake to get stuck in it. To get stuck in this kind of morass of only discussing non-interference, and to realize that many Asian leaders are moving beyond that. And as I concluded, if we move beyond simply this kind of rhetorical clash, but focus on, for example, building institutions, including the rule of law, I think there's more room for dialogue and for building human rights and development that should be beneficial to all.
Great. Doreen, please.
Yeah, I'll just throw in a few comments that I do think it's an interesting question whether or not non-interference remains the governing policy or the dominant policy for ASEAN countries in dealing with intra-regional issues and the issue of Rohingya refugees has been brought up time and again, but also the problem of haze that is a kind of regional problem in terms of its environmental effects, and that ASEAN has been putting together task force and to form policy about how to better address some of these issues. So I think there is some movement there to think about how to kind of softly, again, behind the scenes, deal with some of these problems. I am interested in bringing in China's more global program for its presence in other countries and other continents. So it's not only what China will do or say in Southeast Asia, but also what it does and says in Africa, and why that has such impact in terms of the reception and perception of Chinese economic ventures abroad. So I think that's something there that if there's anything of a revival of a Bandung spirit, it's that leaders of post-colonial countries do gain some sense of recognition that is quite different from the kinds of treatment that they might receive in Western countries, for example. So I think that has some kind of effect as well.
Really interesting. These shifting kind of global alliances and things throughout South and Southeast Asia are so complicated at this moment too, as we watch things changing under our very noses. But it seems to me, if everybody is okay just with a few minutes longer, as an outside observer to all of this, I see when I look at the primarily of the international press and also the U.S. press in particular, there's such an excessive focus on the impact of the elections vis-a-vis primarily looking towards Europe and the need to rebuild diplomatic relations, that it's at the cost of a lot of other types of reporting that would include South and Southeast Asia, it seems to me. And except for we have some, there were little moments where you have quite a bit of focus, say, on the Myanmar elections very briefly and human rights issues with Rohingya and things like that. But a lot of the nuance that you all have been discussing has largely been absent, I think, from the pages of the newspaper. And since this panel is entitled Asia Beyond the Headlines, I was wondering if I could ask each of you, to say, perhaps one thing that you think has been completely missed by foreign observers or the international media in terms of what's happening in South and Southeast Asia. And then perhaps we can use that as a way to draw this to a close. Yeah. Professor Varshney?
Yeah. So the fact that Kamala Harris was a vice presidential candidate and now vice president elect. She combines both Black American background and Indian American background. In the elections in the United States have been of great interest to India, of course, partly because of that, partly because of the sheer power and status of the United States, the largest and most powerful country in the world. But the New York Times and Washington Post in particular, and NPR, if not CNN and MSNBC, and certainly and Fox, the New York Times and Washington Post have done a lot of stories on Kamala Harris's Indian background. Her father is basically missing in the overall reportage. Professor Harris, professor of economics, Stanford, retired now. He has been basically missing because he's been basically missing in her life since the parents divorced in 1968 or 69. But there is a lot of New York Times and Washington Post cannot be accused of having neglected South Asia, especially also because beyond India, there is this whole question of what's happening in Afghanistan and whether the army should be withdrawn or drawn down to a very smaller level, U.S. Army, the army presence there. So, I certainly you may call them elite newspapers, and they are not the equivalent of Fox News in the reading for the reading publics, and they're not equivalent to New York Post either. Wall Street Journal also have been writing quite a bit. So I don't think there's a neglect as far as the elite newspapers are concerned. There might be a neglect. You may be right to say that. You're right to say that there's perhaps serious neglect at the level of what might be called not elite newspapers but mass newspapers, right? So, which would be New York Post and several others. And, I doubt whether the Houston Atlanta Journal-Constitution wrote too many stories about India, etc. But Kamala Harris, her choice brought India into a discussion in a very different way, and I don't think the neglect was the same as 4 years ago, 8 years ago.
Yeah, of course. I mean, and also there's been substantial coverage of Afghanistan, obviously, particularly with Trump's plan for the drawdown of the troops and all of that was going to be accelerated and things. But yes, I agree. And then, but we also do have other places like Nepal, for example, and its relationship with China, or even the rise. One thing that's intriguing to me, which hasn't, I don't think it's been mentioned thus far, is the rise of the economy in Bangladesh, for example, which seems to be happening at a very rapid pace. So in any case, a lot of other kind of factors to think about as we move forward. But would Erik or Doreen also like to mention anything in that regard? How about Doreen first, and then we'll move to Erik.
Sure. I think Indonesia is just in general missing from the news in the US and has been since I think the 1960s was the last time the New Yorker had a stable column on Southeast Asia. So it's not surprising, but I do think there is just a general lack of political will to move Indonesia forward on past human rights violations, which were taken up by some elected officials in the US some years ago when the files about the 1965 coup were declassified. And there is ongoing violence in Papua that is not covered. And I think part of it's the difficulty of access, but also the kind of way that an issue such as Palestine might rebound through the interest of people in Indonesia. I think that was one of the questions that Mike Pompeo was asked when he was in Indonesia recently, what about Palestine? And he sort of brushed off the question. And so I think the kind of complex affinities and relationships between different parts of the world that are artificially split off by regional distinctions, that doesn't seem to emerge too much in the press. So I'll say those few things.
Wonderful, thank you. And Erik, would you like to comment?
Yeah, the only thing I'll say is that in terms of going beyond the headlines, I think if you think of multilateralism and engagement with Southeast Asia, I think what's important is that that both the media and policy pundits and scholars move beyond simply a focus on ASEAN as the organizational sort of linchpin for engaging multilateralism and discussions of foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy with Southeast Asia. ASEAN will always be there. It's not irrelevant, but I think there are many other things that are also relevant in Southeast Asia in terms of advancing priorities we care about, such as development, human rights, and democracy. And the journalists and pundits who get it and go deeper, talk to people on the ground, at the local level, to NGOs, to civil society, to academics engaged with social change. So I think that the importance is not being stuck in a mode of simply working with the official organizations that are already so prominent, but going much deeper on the ground and really talking to those who are working slowly but gradually for social reform.
Can I ask something which we've not discussed at all?
Please.
Certainly from the perspective of economics, Singapore's position in the world economic system has been very important. And with the decline of Hong Kong as a one of the great financial centers for the world economy, and most probably the likely benefit that Singapore is going to receive is quite certainly, I think, or let's say most probably.
I think you broke off, Professor Varshney, but I think we got your point basically just about the issues impacting, now we've lost him completely, but the issues of the decline of Hong Kong as an economic center, though I think some of the predictions for that are still yet to be seen of what the role of Hong Kong might be going forward. But certainly Singapore, sorry, Professor Varshney, we lost you there. I see you're back now. But and as far as isn't Singapore is the leader of ASEAN now, is that not correct? In terms of its financial position. So I'm not sure if anybody would like to comment on Professor Varshney's point about the role of Singapore.
Yeah, the political significance of Singapore and the economic significance of Singapore have always been in conflict because it has never taken pride in being a democracy. In fact, the founder of the country thought that India's democracy was a good reason not to be democratic at all, and made that up. Right? And China's discipline and China's authoritarianism is actually worth following in some ways. But its economic significance, it seems to me, is beyond doubt. So our Southeast Asia colleagues on the panel, would they like to comment on what I've said?
Yeah, I mean, I think Singapore will always have a larger role to play and disproportionate to its geographical size or population size, and with the potential decline of Hong Kong, even more so now. And in terms of questions of democracy, human rights, yeah, I mean, Lee Kuan Yew has always been a critic of democracy, and he's made the same comments about the Philippines, etc. But Singapore still stands out. So it's not black and white, because Singapore still stands out as a country where the rule of law on some level is actually relatively effective. In some ways it's not, because the courts always go in favor of the PAP, the People's Action Party, the dominant hegemonic party. But in many other ways, it's quite robust, and definitely better than the Philippines, which is nominally a democracy. So it's tricky. So economically, I think Ashu is completely right. It will still be a very prominent country and stand out in Southeast Asia. But on the political front, not a democracy, but in terms of some other issues that conform with liberal institutions, Singapore is not doing so badly. So it's always a complex picture for Singapore.
Doreen, would you like to chime in on that?
I'll agree with all those points that Singapore's, I think, outsized role in the region has primarily been played out through ASEAN. And in fact, it would be the consummate it forms the elite core of ASEAN, actually, I think, in many ways. And that the sort of knowledge production in Singapore in terms of centers for strategic and international studies and so on and so forth really make it it's unparalleled in the region, that other ASEAN countries cannot yet compete with the quality of knowledge production there and strategic information, right? And it's also striking that Singapore, I think, perhaps has long displaced Hong Kong in terms of its investment capacities in Southeast Asia, that you'll see a lot of, I think Singapore plays a role like Ireland does, right, for Apple in terms of providing very flexible economic provisions that allow multinational corporations to be headquartered there. So you'll see a lot of investment firms parked in Singapore who then reach out to Malaysia and Indonesia and so on. So that kind of economic prowess and innovative dominance, I think, is still very important.
Great, thank you. And I know we are quite a bit past our scheduled time, but I feel like I've been learning so much. I feel like we could carry this on all afternoon. I would be happy to sit here and just keep chatting with all of you. There's so many interesting topics, but we can't possibly cover everything in the short amount of time that we had available to us. But I will say that we at the Asia Center will continue to offer events and programming relevant to both South and Southeast Asia over time. And we hope we can perhaps even invite some of you back, and as we focus in and actually see what the real effects of the elections are, and also just the ongoing issues in South and Southeast Asia. So we'll keep that going as we move into the next year as well. So I wanted to thank everyone for attending. I know most of the attendees stayed on here till the end, and I'd like to also give a special thanks and acknowledge the Lakshmi Middle Family South Asia Institute at Harvard for co-sponsoring today's event. But most of all, I'd like to thank our four panelists, Professors Fibiger, who had to leave for another commitment, Professor Kuhonta, Professor Lee, and Professor Varshney for their insightful remarks, which have really helped me personally also to think about what to expect, or even what to look out for, pay attention after the inauguration of President-elect Biden on January 20th. So we'll see how all of this evolves over the next period of time with the new administration, and see what kinds of continuity or changes happen in these very important regions, and we'll keep an eye on everything. So let me end by thanking you all again very much for all of your insightful comments today, and thank again the audience for joining us. So thank you very much.